In 1860 America, a skilled blacksmith could sell for more than a luxury mansion today. A teenage girl could be worth more than a modern sports car. Yet the average white man earned just $500 a year. So the question is simple: who could afford slaves, and how? This is a story of America's darkest marketplace and the economic engine that powered it. In the final years before the Civil War, human beings were bought and sold like livestock across the United States. It wasn't a fringe activity. It was a core part of the American economy. The prices were staggering. A healthy adult male, fit for field labor, could cost the modern equivalent of $60,000. A woman was valued around $40,000. But the most disturbing prices were reserved for the so-called fancy girls. These were young, often mixed-race women, sometimes just teenagers, sold privately in discreet auctions for sums that could exceed $100,000 in today's money. In 1859 New Orleans, a highly skilled enslaved blacksmith was sold for a price equivalent to what a high-end luxury car costs now. An entire family could be sold for the price of a small business. These were not exaggerations or isolated incidents. They were the market prices in a system where human life was a traded commodity. The numbers are cold, precise, and documented in ledgers and auction records that still exist today. They tell a story of calculated, brutal. But here's the part history textbooks rarely explain: the economic paradox at the heart of it all. In 1860, the average white American man, even a skilled tradesman, earned the equivalent of about $500 a year. Most families north and south struggled just to survive. They lived in small homes, worked long hours, and had little to no disposable income. So when we hear about slaves selling for tens of thousands of dollars, a massive contradiction emerges. How could anyone afford them? The math just doesn't add up. If the average person couldn't even dream of such wealth, who was buying and selling all these human beings? The answer reveals the true, hidden structure of slavery, one that goes far beyond the simplistic image of a farmer and his workers. Contrary to the popular belief that slavery was widespread among all white Southerners, the reality was quite different. The vast majority of white Americans, even in the South, owned no slaves at all. They simply couldn't afford them. So, where were they? The ownership of human beings was heavily concentrated in the hands of a small, powerful minority. First, you had the wealthy plantation elites, the 1% of their time. These were families who owned vast tracts of land and hundreds of enslaved people, operating their plantations like massive agricultural corporations. Their wealth was generational, built over decades on the backs of forced labor. Then, you had the financial institutions. Banks and investment groups in cities like Charleston, Richmond, and even New York City were deeply involved. They didn't just lend money to planters. They took enslaved people as collateral. If a planter defaulted on a loan, the bank would seize his property, which included the men, women, and children he claimed to own. These institutions then became slave owners themselves, sometimes leasing them out or selling them to recoup their investment. There were also estates. When a wealthy slave owner died, his enslaved people were treated as assets, passed down to his heirs just like land, silver, or stocks. This is how generational wealth was built and maintained, literally on the inherited ownership of other humans. Finally, there were business owners and urban professionals. Doctors, lawyers, and merchants would buy one or two enslaved people, not for farm labor, but as an investment. They would rent them out to others for a steady stream of income, turning a human life into a passive revenue stream. Slaves weren't just workers. They were capital. They were collateral. They were used to secure loans, insure plantations, and build the fortunes of a select few. This is the key to understanding the system. Enslaved people were not just laborers. They were financial instruments. They could be mortgaged, just like a house. A plantation owner could take out a massive loan using the value of his enslaved population to finance expansion or cover his debts. They could be leased. An owner who didn't need a worker for a certain period could rent them out to a neighbor or a local business, collecting a fee for their labor while still retaining ownership. This was especially common in cities where enslaved people were rented out as dock workers, factory hands, or domestic servants. They could be insured. Companies, some of which still exist today in different forms, offered insurance policies on the lives of enslaved people. If an enslaved person died, the owner would receive a cash payout, mitigating his financial loss. This practice underscores the chilling reality that a human life was valued only for its economic output. And as we've seen, they could be inherited, passed down through wills as the most valuable part of an estate, ensuring that the wealth generated by one generation's exploitation was handed down to the next. For many of these owners, slavery was an abstract financial gain. Some lived in cities far from the plantations and never even met the people whose forced labor made them rich. They simply collected the profits, managed their assets, and watched their wealth grow. This transforms our understanding of slavery. It wasn't just a moral crime committed by cruel individuals. It was a sophisticated, deeply embedded financial system that powered the American economy. It was Wall Street before Wall Street. This leads to the illusion of the average slave owner. The system created a narrative that every white Southerner was invested in slavery, but the direct beneficiaries were a small elite. However, that doesn't mean ordinary people didn't benefit. The vast majority of white Americans who could never afford to buy another person still reaped the rewards of the system, whether they realized it or not. The cotton, tobacco, and sugar produced by enslaved labor made these goods incredibly cheap. This meant lower food prices and more affordable clothing for everyone. The immense profits generated by the slave economy fueled industrial growth even in the northern states. Banks that financed plantations used those profits to invest in railroads and factories. The economic dominance of the United States in the 19th century was built on a foundation of stolen labor. Slavery shaped America's economy long before it shaped its laws, creating a distorted prosperity that touched everyone, even those who owned no one. When people argue about history, they often debate numbers, dates, and statistics. But behind every price tag in an auction ledger, behind every entry in a plantation's account book, was a human life. A life with a name, a family, a future that was stolen. We can talk about the economic impact, the financial instruments, the market forces, but we must never forget that the asset being traded was a person who loved, who dreamed, who feared, and whose entire existence was reduced to a dollar amount. Slavery wasn't cheap. Its costs can't be measured in dollars. It was priceless because it cost humanity itself. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more hidden histories.